I think probably one of the most interesting comments, though, that I've picked up from several of you in the time here has been the fact that in the way I've tried to go at talking about Jesus and the biblical characters, there seems to be a much more earthy and real tone to who they are than a lot of the abstract, stained glass window, unapproachable King of Denmark variety that we often get. And it's there that I hope to have made my chief contribution to the conference this weekend. And that is to try to jar some of you out of the lethargy that comes from sitting there believing you understand it all like you've seen it. It wouldn't hurt any of us occasionally to subject what we think to what really is. And you learn an awful lot that way. And I constantly try to go back. People say, how do you, where do you get these crazy ideas? I don't really know. All I know is I try terribly hard to shift gears and try to understand how the apostles and the disciples and the people in Jesus' time saw him before the crucifixion, you see. Have an idea, if you didn't know the crucifixion and Easter were around the corner, you would have looked at him a good deal differently. But Monday after Easter, he was something else. And all of our gospel record is written after Easter. And I think you have to get back and remember what it would have been like to know him, to see him, to be around him before you understood that about him. And the Scriptures are explicit and clear that the disciples really didn't know who he was till after Easter. It's awfully easy to go back and fill commentary that was made somewhere back in Caesarea Philippi with content that you only understood after Easter, and totally miss how you would have reacted to him at the moment when he said that. Now that is precisely the point that I want to try to make this morning. Imagination, Pratt's story here with James and Simon Peter talking on the phone. That's pure imagination, pulled up out of nothing, right? But I think if you'd let James and Peter talk to each other, they would have had some elbowing and a little fun, Hey, Jim, slap hands, I think they would have been. They didn't go around, good morning unto thee, Jim, That's weird, just weird. Now, we want to carve them out of soap and put them in stained glass windows and sit back and go, holy, holy, holy. And they would have grinned at most of us. Because they would much rather just sit down at the table and visited and had fun, kicked off their sandals and relax. We don't want them to. We want them to stay off in the distance and let us bow down and worship and think they had something we don't have, access to something we don't have access to. Probably the biggest mystery in the Bible to me is the mystery that surrounds the person of Jesus. And I've tried for some time to unravel the makeup of this man. To me, he's not what most of us anticipate physically. We want him to be 6'4", weigh 210, run 110 flat, and play halfback for the Rams. And be white. He was a Jew of the Jews. He was a man of his time. He was probably not over 5, 6, or 7, sort of barrel-chested, thick-necked, and stocky, olive complexion, deep-set coal black beard, dancing, sparkling chocolate brown eyes, long flowing black hair. Get out of that Tony Home permanent bit in the garden. That's the weirdest excuse for a picture I've ever seen. I don't care how much that picture means to you. If you could see the man, you'd say that is a gross misrepresentation of him. Did you ever see a red-headed, blonde, green-eyed, white-skinned Jew? I don't believe you ever did. Like trying to make Martin Luther King white when he gets okay in our minds, You can't do that. So here was Jesus of Nazareth, a man of his time, stocky, thick-handed, tough-skinned, Now, I always wondered about him, getting to be the kind of man that stepped out on the stage at 30, wrestling with options. To me, the temptation experience in the wilderness is not just 40 days and nights, it's a beautiful parable of the young adult years for him when he was wrestling with all the things he could have done with himself. You lay the emphasis in the wrong place when you talk about the temptations in the wilderness. We ought to be talking about decisions in the wilderness. What he could have done, but what he chose to do. Who he chose to be. You have to allow him to choose that, or he's nothing but a robot that God wound up, and he didn't even do that with Adam. So, here was a man who chose to fulfill the will of God. Some of us think at age 3 he could fly a jet and work calculus. And there are legends about his childhood that grew up early in the church that as a child of 4, he used to make little birds out of mud and breathe on them, and they would flap and fly away. You giggle at that, but then you say walked on the water, and you say, right. Now, people wanted to attach all sorts of extraneous mystery to this man. He was probably just simple, plain, ordinary, common old household variety folks who lived his life in the most committed fashion of any man who ever strolled the face of the earth, and sets the example for how we are to live. In him is life. In him is light. In him is the kind of joy that brings meaning and purpose to where we are. Now, where was he at your age? What was he wrestling with? What sorts of pressures were on him? What was he learning? How did he come out of those young adult years of turmoil with a kind of insight that helps him stand in front of the Pharisees and say, let him without sin cast the first stone? Where does he come up with the kind of insight that talks about God as a loving Father, a seeking shepherd? Where does he get that? Where does he get the insights from the Sermon on the Mount? If a man smites you on one cheek, turn the other cheek also. If a man commands you to give him your outer cloak, give him your undershirt too. Where did he get that? Most of us think that he wandered around in the wilderness 40 days and nights with a notepad, jotting down sermon thoughts for future reference. And he would say, if a man strikes you on one cheek, put him out. Hey, that's good. That'll preach. You know? Strange. To him, truth was like manna in the wilderness. You just sort of picked it up, observed it, held it to the light, munched on it. It was available if you had eyes to see and ears to hear. And his common criticism of people was they stumble over truth hunting for it. Like the old drunk, old joke. Down on his hands and knees under a street light, looking around, the cop walks up and says, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to find a quarter. He says, where'd you drop it? He said, about 2 blocks over there. He said, why are you looking over here? He said, there's a light over here. You know. Now, there are people who stumble over things looking in the wrong places. And Jesus was one of those persons, I think, who shows us in his life that you learn that kind of truth not in the abstract by sitting around thinking up clever commentary, but you learn that kind of truth by doing it, by living it, being sensitive to it. I don't think he thought up the other cheek because it was a cool idea. I think he thought it up because he got the first one hit one time. You see? Now, let's put him in a situation. I just made this up and put it in the Bible because I think this needs to be done at this point. Whether you think so or not, I think so. In this story, I'm trying to wrestle with the question of Jesus as a teenager, 17 years old, okay? Young Jewish boy at his strength. We don't know much about him. At 3, they slipped off to Egypt with him and came back. And now at 12, they get off down the road after the Passover and can't find him. They turn the wagon train upside down. Where is he? Mary and Joseph go all the way back to Jerusalem and find him at the temple, and the Scripture says he was bewildering the elders. Now, Mary didn't walk up to him and say, "Oh, son, where hast thou been for 4 days?" No, man, you know. She walks up with her bony finger in his nose and says, "Where have you been?" And with a twinkle in his eye and his hands in his toga pockets, a rather familiar position for him for years to come, he looks at Mary and says, "Oh, just bewildering the elders." And there you had that inquisitive spirit. The thing that was bewildering the elders was they were spouting off commentary and ritual, and he kept saying, "Why? How come? Now, wait a second." And they'd say, "Would you please hush? But I don't understand why you would feel." And they'd say, He wasn't bewildering. The word really in Aramaic translated my style ought to be exasperating the elders. You ever sit around and ask your folks questions about God, and they'd say, "Would you just shut up and believe?" You know. You ask a question, your folks say, "Now, you've been taught better than that." I used to say, "No, I've been taught different than that." Now, it's that kind of bewildering inquisitiveness. And here he comes, age 17. Now, let your mind just sort of flow in neutral for a minute. Let me set this scene. Let's put him in it and see how I believe he came by those kinds of insights and what I think they do for him as a young man that may be helpful to some of us, struggling in these years to be honest with ourselves, with God, and with our fellow men. In this story, he's 17 years old. It's a beautiful Thursday afternoon, about 2 o'clock. He and Joseph have been working together in the carpenter shop. They just finished a new coffee table for Martha and Ezra. And varnish is shining and neat. They hang a sheet around it in the corner so the dust won't blow on it. It's too early to go home. It's too late to start another project. Good day to clean up the shop. So they start hanging tools back on the wall, putting lumber back in the proper slots, sweep off the counter. They roll up all the little curlicues and triangles they've sawed off and sweep the 2x4 sawdust up on a little piece of cardboard, and they take it out in the back and pile it up. And he's standing in the back with a long limb, kicking little fall-away pieces back in the fire in the sun, just lazily burning the rubbish from their hard day's work.